G'day, g'day, and welcome back to another episode of The Experience. By now, I hope you know that it's the captain of the ship, your boy behind the mic, Bradley J. Driver. And it's always a pleasure to be here in The Experience HQ. It's been a couple of weeks now, getting very cozy in here and loving having my guests either face-to-face or like we are today, across the screen on Zoom. And today's guest is a very exciting one because as I was saying to her in today's little bit of pre-chat and pre-ramble, she's the first female guest in a couple of weeks. So ladies, get excited because I know you've all been messaging me saying you'd love more female guests. So I'm delivering. Here we are. And this lady deserves an incredible intro. She burst into the fitness scene 5 years ago as a bodybuilder, and more recently in the last 2 years has transitioned more so towards the mental peak fitness, mental health, studying, and putting a lot of work into her clients with the psychological side of things, which we all know is so important and potentially even more important than the way you look after your body physically. So I'm very excited to be here. So from your home, your car, or wherever you are, give a very, very warm welcome to the one, the only, the very lovely Nikki Cassa. How are you, Nikki?
What an intro. Hey, Bradley, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on today.
It's my absolute pleasure. You're someone who I guess I come across in the last couple of weeks, or more so the last month and a bit. And as soon as I come across you, you've got a very bright and bubbly personality that shines through the screen on socials. And I found myself scrolling through and having a look at all the amazing things you're doing. And I thought you'd be a great guest to have on here because if anyone's listened to, I think you'll be episode 79 of The Experience, which is exciting. If you've listened to 78 of the previous or a few of the previous as our listeners and viewers, I'm sure you know that we always tend to come back to sort of that mental peak performance and fitness stuff that I think is so important in not just my life, but everyone's life, to get the most out of every day, to get the most out of your business or career ventures, to get the most out of just living life to the fullest. And I'm really excited to talk to you about all those things today and your amazing journey along the way. But I believe every good story starts with a bit of a background, a bit of an understanding of where you come from and why you're sitting in front of us sharing this message today. So do you mind giving us a bit of an idea of who you are?
Sure. Yeah, of course. And, I must say that looking at your space and the messages that you're sharing with the world and putting out there really resonated with me. And I'm very particular with the types of podcasts, interviews that I do, because, that message is really important and can have such a huge catalyst for change in people's lives. So I really resonated with everything that you share, both on your socials, but on this podcast in particular.
Thank you
So
so much.
I'll dive into a little bit with where I actually grew up, because I'm not actually originally from Sydney. I'm from Adelaide, and I grew up there mainly wanting to do dancing and going to be a dance teacher. And I thought that was where I saw my career going, per se. And then 4 years ago, I experienced a really traumatic event, and that really was a deciding point for me with where I wanted that future to go. And it really did shift that whole trajectory for me. So since then, I immersed myself into bodybuilding. I was already training at that stage, but not really committed to it. So I went on to do bodybuilding, earned my pro card, moved here to Sydney, and started to explore more about mind-body approaches in particular, a lot of neuroscience approaches, looking at our nervous systems after something like a traumatic event and how they go through survival. And it's really led me to where I am now as a mind-body practitioner.
That's an amazing little recap and very well recapped. You've done a very good job there. It's usually hard for people to recap their stories so well, but you've done a great job. And I guess I want to go back to one point in that little journey there that you just discussed. And I know you're big on talking about your past trauma because you believe it will allow you to help the people that are within your coaching group, but also within the connection and the circle that follow you around social and the life you live. Do you mind touching on those traumatic experiences a little bit and helping us understand what happened?
Yeah, of course. So I have to take you back a little bit further than what happened 4 years ago. And just for, the women out there listening as well, just a bit of a trigger warning for anyone who's experienced sexual assault. So when I was a little girl, I was sexually assaulted by 3 men, and I was only 14 at the time. And I really found it hard to open up about that. I stayed silent, mainly because I felt as if my power was taken from me, and I lost that sense of having my voice and being able to say no. I was very scared to be judged, and who would believe a 14-year-old, right? Would they blame me? Would they say it was my fault? And so I stayed silent about it. And I think it's really important to share this, Bradley, especially given how recent a lot of women have begun to open up about, sexual harassment or assault or rape. And it can be quite a delicate topic. And, unfortunately, it does happen to women, and it can even happen to young teenagers as well.
Of course. Can I interject quickly there? And like at any stage, if you say, look, that's too personal and I don't want to answer those questions, feel free to tell me. I want to make sure that you're completely comfortable throughout the course of this. But with those 3 men that sexually assaulted you when you were 14, did you know those people, or were they people that were foreign to you?
So I was dating an older gentleman at the time, would have been 3 or 4 years older than me. And we had gone to his friend's house. And at one stage throughout the night, he'd left. And I didn't know where he'd gone. I thought maybe he went out to go and get more alcohol or food or whatever it was. But he never came back.
Okay. So, I'm really sorry to hear that. And so that's obviously led on to then another traumatic experience in, I think you said the past 4 years?
Yeah. So just to share something really important before I continue on with that, I think it's really important as we open up discussions like this, especially for anyone who might be listening, whether that is a man or a woman, who might be experiencing something similar that might not feel safe to open up or share in the ways that I didn't when I was younger. And I certainly think that although having conversations like this, it doesn't condone like what those men did, I also don't think it's important to share this to create shame for men. I don't think it's helpful to create a resource like that. However, I do see a huge opportunity to connect with those types of, again, men and women who might have their own experience in this or might not be able to make sense of it all. And so if you have had your own experience, I think the number one thing you can do is look for a support network after a traumatic event like that, and finding some sort of safety and security, whether that's with your friends, your family, maybe a mentor, or perhaps even professional support, where you can begin to create pathways for feeling safe enough to open up about it, knowing that it wasn't your fault. And that allows you to create some pathways for healing, for regulation in your system, and as well integration for the experience as well.
Is there any support networks that you'd recommend people reaching out to? Like, are there any organizations as such?
Yeah, of course there are. So you can go online and there's a whole heap of organizations out there. I honestly couldn't give you any off the top of my head because in my own healing experience, I work directly face-to-face with therapists and psychologists. For me, opening up, I felt a lot safer doing that one-on-one with a therapist. But I'm sure there's a lot of, helplines where you can call up and get advice, whether that's to share or whether to know where you can go from there. And perhaps we can leave some links in the bio, in the podcast that might be helpful for people listening.
Yeah, definitely. We can most certainly do that. And I was actually going to suggest we'll throw those in there when the show goes out. And of course, if anyone feels like they need that information, please feel comfortable using it. And like Nikki said, it's definitely not something that should be, there shouldn't be any stigmas around it or any reason for you to feel as though you shouldn't be reaching out to those people. It's definitely worth having the conversation that may not be necessary, as opposed to sitting there and thinking the conversation isn't necessary, where it could have been very helpful. So For you, Nikki, I think, I've spoken to a few people who have specialized in mental health and run organizations that work with people struggling with mental health issues or traumatic past experiences. And there seems to be this real importance, and I think rightfully so, around, whilst at the time, I'm sure when that trauma was happening, your visits to a psychologist or therapist were more regular. What's the importance on, even now, years on from these events, still checking in from time to time? Is that something you do? Is it something you feel is necessary or should even be common practice for most people?
Yes, so we have something within our nervous system that keeps us safe after a traumatic experience. There are 5 survival pathways, which I want to talk about towards the end of today's podcast. But what the mind likes to do, the brain, to keep us safe, is it stores traumatic experience in the form of an implicit or an explicit memory. And so those memories there, either if they're too traumatic, they're going to be stored within that memory to keep you safe from that. So an implicit memory would be stored deep within the subconscious because it might be too much for you to re-experience. Whereas an explicit memory would be, when I was 14, this thing happened. Whereas an implicit would be more around what that felt like for you, how you experienced it, what you saw, how that felt. And so by doing ongoing healing, whether that's with a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, counselor, it allows you to create little glimmers. And I mean little glimmers because sometimes slower is a lot safer for a nervous system. So it creates little glimmers for you to open up around these memories and these experiences to, again, integrate them and allow you to either normalize and make sense of it all, or then create some coping mechanisms to ensure that you do feel safe and you don't go into relationships with, a traumatic abandonment or painful memories that are resurfacing for you.
Would that be similar to, because, excuse my, I guess, ignorance and lack of education around this topic, it's not something I've had to deal with personally. So, which is, I feel very grateful and very lucky for. However, I've heard a lot and looked into a lot of PTSD stuff, and would those implicit memories and those things that tend to come out and be a little bit rawer as you speak to a therapist, is that similar to what PTSD sufferers would have, where they're recalling those events that maybe even things they forgot that actually happened, or moments they'd forgotten within those traumatic experiences?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, post-traumatic stress disorder and complex PTSD, a lot of survivors, when we look at that, we're looking at, well, what's the brain is doing there, which is surviving from an experience that felt life-threatening. And I say felt because sometimes, whether it's you felt that you were going to, be in a situation where your life was taken from you, or whether that's something that was physically happening, like per se a war veteran, the experience of the trauma still feels very real. And so in some ways, whether it's PTSD, complex PTSD, whether it's just some childhood wounds that came up for you, maybe around when your parents got divorced, there's always going to be a part of your brain that wants to protect you from that if it felt very traumatic.
Of course. And for you, Nikki, how important was not only dealing with these things, but getting fresh starts and new beginnings for yourself? Because you speak about your move from Adelaide to Sydney. And is that something that your career brought you this way? Is it something that it was just pure adventure and a new challenge? Or was that important to come and get a fresh new start and lay new foundations for the life ahead?
Wow, this all happened after what happened 4 years ago to me. And I know everyone's probably sitting in the edge of their seats with anticipation because I haven't shared it just yet. So in 2017, I went on a holiday to Bali with 6 friends of mine. And we were there for about 10 days. And halfway through what was supposed to be a really fun trip, it quickly turned really bad when my drink was spiked, where while we were staying in the villa. And I didn't pass out. I had, full functions of my body, but my state of mind became really disoriented. And because we were in a villa and we hadn't gone to a club or a bar or a restaurant, this paranoia of not knowing how this happened heightened the trip that I was in, and I became stuck in it. I couldn't get myself out of this drug trip that I was in.
Yeah, wow. So is that something that for you personally, were you able to pretty quickly pick up that something was wrong?
Well, I didn't know at first because I was so confused around what have I eaten? What have I had to drink today? Okay, so I've had the milkshake, I've had the zucchini salad, what else? And so at first I wasn't sure. And I thought maybe I was just feeling anxious. Maybe I hadn't had enough water for the day. And it actually took me a good 6-7 hours before I was like, okay, like there's something going on. I feel super weird. And it wasn't until then that I started to try and speak up to say I feel weird. And I was quite gaslighted. You're fine. Don't be paranoid. Don't worry about it. Sort of thing, which just exacerbated everything because I felt that nobody understood.
Was there any, I guess, fear in that moment, knowing that that's happened with inside your villa means that it's someone who's broken your trust? Is there any fear that, am I speaking out to the wrong people? Am I speaking out to people I can't trust? How do you deal with that internally?
Well, in a lot of ways, I had to deal with it internally because when I tried to speak up, it was like fingers were pointed back at me as, you're being crazy and you need to snap out of it. And it's like telling someone who's having an anxiety attack to snap out of it. No, you can't. There's emotional flooding in your nervous system. You can't just snap out of something like that.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of fear because we were on a small island. We were on Gilly Island. There was no motorized vehicles. There was no hospitals. The locals hardly spoke English. And normally when you have, a trip like that, whether it's psychedelic or something else, it can last anywhere from, an hour up to 10 hours before it starts to wear off. And this trip that I got stuck in that I couldn't get out of lasted for 3 days.
Oh my God. Wow. Okay. So that's super intense. And at the time that this happened, so you're in the villa. Was this like a villa party? Was this just you and your friends? Like, what's the situation? Sort of paint a picture of that scene for us.
Yeah. So it was just the 6 of us. And I mean, look, there's not a lot of rules in Bali. So if you wanted to get mushroom cocktails brought to the villa on Gili Island, where mushrooms are quite known, you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? And so my first thought was maybe the mushroom cocktails, everyone got them instead of just the people who had ordered them. And that's the only rational explanation I could think of. The other thought was maybe the restaurant put some food in, something in my food. But then I thought, I don't know if that would come from the staff. It didn't seem very rational. So in a lot of ways, Bradley, I still don't know. But you can only assume that, they wanted everyone to have fun. And what was the harm in that, right? Until there was harm in it, right?
Yeah. And throughout the course of those 3 days, what were the consequences of the trip that you were in? Because I can imagine, like, as someone, I sit here as someone who, I don't drink because I've got liver disease, but got a lot of people that drink around me. Like I'm 25, or nearly 25. And so I experience drinking from the outside, looking towards my mates and the people around me. As someone who's never participated in drugs, I don't know that feeling either. So for me to sit there and think, okay, I know how much I like to be in control of my body. I'm a bit of a control freak in that way. I can't imagine what it would feel like to almost feel as though you don't have any control at all. And I'm sure that's probably what you felt. what are the consequences of that feeling throughout the course of 72 hours?
Yeah, I mean, you can only start to use your imagination to know what that was like.
Yeah.
Most of the time when I look back at it, Bradley, one of the biggest things that really was a consequence for me was that I was alone and I just didn't have the help. And it was less to do with what happened to me and more to do with what didn't happen, where I didn't feel safe, I didn't feel looked after, I didn't know who I could trust, who I could go to. I was on the other side of, like, I was overseas. I couldn't just get on a bus or a flight or a taxi or an Uber and just go home.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 24 hours later when we got back to the main island in Bali where I really tried to speak up and say, I don't feel right. There's something wrong. You know, I need to go to a clinic. I need to go to a hospital. And the response that I got from my friends at the time was, Nikki, you're ruining our holiday. Either you need to leave this villa or we're leaving you. And I was standing there just gobsmacked of like, are these my friends? Is this actually happening? Or am I also hallucinating this? Because I was so shocked of how is it that I'm feeling so afraid to speak up, and also the response that I was getting from them. You know, and Bradley, you're quite a very, you know, grounded moral person. And I could imagine for you, and just like any of my friends, if they were in that situation, I would do anything to make sure they felt okay and safe. You know, and I just, yeah, I felt very abandoned because it was more what didn't happen and the help and the safety that I didn't receive.
Does that make you now like, you know, I think the world we live in is so scary because whilst there's so many great and, you know, moral, amazing human beings and random acts of kindness, and there's so much great that happens in this world, in 2021, unfortunately, there's a lot of bad that happens too. And these things are definitely more common than they should be. As someone who has a younger sister, who, if anyone knows me, they know I adore my younger sister. I'm extremely protective. I remember standing in the back of nightclubs for weeks on end when she turned 18, watching like a hawk. And just like my dad was the same. And, you know, I know how much it frightens me that that's the world that she lives in. And I'm blessed that she has an amazing partner and she has so many great friends and great people around her that's never been a reality for her. But I know that I worry that, you know, in this world, an open drink is an easy target. Someone who's had a few drinks already and maybe isn't as aware as they always would be is an incredibly vulnerable target. What does that make you feel like when you go out now and you socialize in Sydney, or you socialize, you know, when you go back home to Adelaide, or, you know, are you paranoid that something's going to happen?
I have to laugh because I don't go out anymore.
Yeah.
It's quite funny because Mum was telling me that if I come home to Adelaide over the weekend, I might have to quarantine. I said, Mum, I pretty much quarantine at the moment, working from home.
Yeah.
But jokes aside, when I first came back from the experience, I did notice that. I felt, who can I trust? Is everyone going to abandon me? And unfortunately, it's not really a healthy way to live. You know, it's just after like a breakup and then you decide you're never going to have a boyfriend again because you're worried about getting your heart hurt. You know, these things do happen. And you can look at your situations, just like I know you have with your experiences, and say, okay, you know, I can choose to be a victim of this, or I can choose to learn from my experiences. So when I go out now, street smart to make sure I'm keeping myself safe and being careful who I spend time with. I have a lot of situational awareness now and a lot of emotional intelligence around who I spend my time with. Whereas before I just hung out with the popular people. Whereas now, you know, I care about people's energy. I care about how they speak to other people, how they treat other people, especially. So I know now I have a lot more conscious control and power over situations like that. But you can never be sure, right? You can never predict the future. And I don't think I used to live like that, where I never had any friends because I was so scared of abandonment. But I realized it was a really lonely way to live.
I second that. Like the power of having great people around you is so important. It's something I speak about a lot because I'm blessed that I've got the most amazing family in the world. I've got some extremely close mates who I could call on for anything, but I've got some amazing people outside of those people who have been there for a long period of time, who are meeting in the last year, the last 2 years, who just like, you know, I've got a crew that I run with early in the morning and at 6 a.m., like the amount of people that put their hands up for a half marathon on a Wednesday morning is ridiculous, but it's so positive to go, it's crazy. I've got a group at this age that want to be positive role models for each other, want to push each other to do amazing things. And, you know, I think for anyone listening, be so strict on who you allow into your life, you know, and it's, like you said, after a traumatic experience, you learn that the people around you are so important, but don't let it be a traumatic experience that wakes you up to that reality. I think start to assess the people around you, ask honest questions of them and ask hard questions of them that tell you whether you're aligned and whether you're moving in the right direction, because your life will be affected by it. It's true what they say, the 5 people around you, you know, if they're all doing terrible things, you'll probably be the 6th person to do terrible things. And, you know, it goes the other way too. If they're all on incredible paths to success, great happiness and great things in their life, well, you won't be far behind them, if behind them at all. So important, so important. Talk to me about how all of this has become, was it a catalyst for you to dive into the world of fitness and health? Was fitness and health, obviously you were a dancer growing up, it's obviously ingrained in you in some way, shape or form, but what inspires you to dive into bodybuilding?
Yeah, so after that experience, I started to have lots of, I guess, awakenings. And in a lot of ways, that whole experience was quite a spiritual awakening for me. And that was actually one of the first things I learned, which was you become the top 5 people you spend your most time with. And that was like a mirror, right? It felt really symbolic as well at the time. It was like I was holding this mirror, looking at myself into my life, and I was able to see my identity, who I was, in a completely new perspective. And you know what I said to myself, Bradley? I said, if those were the type of people I was hanging out with, what kind of things did that say about me and my moral compass? And this really, it was painful, but my gosh, it was really liberating, because I was able at that time to decide, was path A going to be to stay silent about it and pretend like nothing happened, or I was going to say no. You know, I am powerful enough to move from this experience and be the person who I want to be. And so I kind of looked at this concept called Ikigai, which is a Japanese meaning for, oh gosh, now I'm going to have to go off the top of my memory, a reason for living, I think it is, and I'm paraphrasing here, meaning for life again. And I looked at, well, what do I love doing? Well, I love helping people. I loved teaching. I liked seeing people grow and develop. And I was also in the gym at the time, but of course my lifestyle didn't reflect a healthy person. So I got, okay, so there's something I'm passionate about, something I'm really good at. And I decided that I actually wanted to change industries and go into helping people as a personal trainer.
Amazing.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways it kept me going, because in the midst of all that healing, there was a lot of pain, you know, and I call that time of my life the valley of despair, because there was a lot of awakenings and they were hard pill to swallows of who I was and the ways I was living, and anchoring to the health and fitness industry, anchoring to my bodybuilding was one of the most important ways for me to find that purpose and meaning in my life again.
And I must say, like, you can tell that you keep fit and healthy all the time, even though you don't bodybuild per se now and compete, you keep incredibly healthy. But looking back, I was like, wow, she actually had an amazing crack on stage. Like, you were in very much peak stage condition, and you obviously dedicated a lot of your life to it. But I know people who have competed in bodybuilding. For me personally, well, number one, I said this the other day on a podcast, I definitely don't have the physique for it. And number two, I definitely do not have the discipline to have that little food and restrain myself so much. I am an eater, and Easter proved that, if ever. But it's something that I believe would build incredible mental resilience in somebody to go through the journey of bulking up, cutting down, being stage ready, being accountable day on day, week on week. How much did that do for your mental fitness, or was it a detriment to it?
Well, this is quite a journey for me, because when I first started competing, and full transparency, the reasons why I first started competing was because I wanted to look for a sense of worthiness. I was in a really dark place, and I thought, maybe this thing will make me feel good again. So I want to really voice that and just honor that, the reasons why I got into that. And although it's not a horrible, bad thing, because that was what got me out of that experience. But I quickly realized, because that was fueling my needs for competing, when I wasn't competing, it then led to a lot of sabotaging behaviors, because I didn't have the body off season. And so if I didn't have the body, then I didn't feel worthy. So a lot of sabotaging behaviors, body dysmorphia. So when you look in the mirror, you see something very different to what's actually there.
Yeah.
A lot of disordered eating. So, carbs are bad and I have to eat clean. So just a very unhealthy way of looking at food. And so I had a conversation with my mentor, and this was early 2018, before my last show as a pro. And I started to notice this, and she created these very thought-provoking questions that helped me to see those initial reasons for competing. And that was really powerful for me, because then I could redefine that and get on stage when I did last and make it more around a high-performing athlete, and getting on stage to showcase all that hard work. But unfortunately, because I'd spent so many years competing for very different reasons, I created some very strong neurological pathways in my brain for how I saw my body. So then after my last competition, I had a really bad cycle of my body dysmorphia. And instead of saying, I'll just compete again, I went, no. Okay. I need to take a pause here from my bodybuilding and really start working on this relationship with myself, this relationship with my body, and really my identity of who I thought I was.
Of course. And is that what then obviously spurred the interest in the psychological and the mental side of health and fitness and the importance of that? And talk to me about discovering that relationship and the importance of that, because I can imagine, as someone who's done similar to that in the last year or two, with a real change in my life and the way I look at fitness and health and the way I've been treating my body, it's powerful stuff. It feels very good, doesn't it?
Yeah, really powerful. So this is really where the interest for me went into neuroscience. So I started learning more about neuroscience from a mentor of mine, with a coach that I was being coached by.
Yep.
And I started using the models in neuroscience to look at my experience with competing. And so neuroscience is the study of your nervous system. And within your nervous system, there's 5 survival pathways. So the 5 survival pathways are fight, flight, freeze, collapse, and attach. Now, when you do something like a bodybuilding competition, maybe you're preparing for a running event, Bradley, maybe you've got something coming up that requires a high stakes of you needing to put in a high effort. Yep. What happens is your activation in your nervous system goes up. Maybe you need to plan, maybe there's lots of movement, maybe there's lots of deliberate exercises you do, there's the training, all the physical stuff, the focus, building relationships, networking. There's a lot of external stimulus. And so the stimulus in the nervous system internally has to go up to match the external stimulus.
Okay.
So you might notice that before a race or before a running event, you might get butterflies in your tummy. Maybe your heart rate elevates, maybe you get sweaty palms. And that's an indication that your internal activation is going up, 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 because there's this external perceived demand on the body. Am I following you?
Yeah, definitely. I can relate to all of this.
Yeah. So what happens, and this is more in relation to my experience after a bodybuilding competition, what happens when all that external stimulus goes away? You're not posing, you're not doing the nutrition, you're not training 2 times a day, 7 days a week, you're not getting 15,000 steps. All of these things that you've got to do to get the job done, they go away overnight. But the activation in your internal nervous system, that doesn't know you've just done a bodybuilding competition or a running event. And when there's too much activation in the nervous system, it will have to go into a crash to regulate that. So what goes up, up, up must come down, down, down. And this is where you might hear a bodybuilder talk about post-comp blues. Or maybe after a really big event, there's almost like this, oh, like what's my next goal? I feel really lost. Or a project, I'm not really sure now. I've been focusing on this one thing for so long. And so that would be an indication that maybe there's a collapse. So I feel no energy, I'm zoned out, I'm procrastinating, I can't take care of myself, I feel depressed, I just want to sleep.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because I know for me personally, post my event, there was like, well, my next marathon's maybe 9 to 12 months away. What's next? Like, what do I do? Where do I focus my energy? And I found myself probably getting a little bit lazy, or like you said, procrastinating a fair bit. And so that's why it was important for me to find new goals and new things to focus on. So
Yeah.
keep explaining, because this is great. I feel like it'd be so relatable for so many people.
And I really want to give an example for how this shows up for modern day men, because this is not just for people who have, you know, these really hectic, demanding events or bodybuilding competitions. This shows up for a lot of corporate people. This shows up for people running their own business. So an external demand, we get in the car and old Jan in front of us is driving really slow. And people who have perhaps really high activation in their system, what do? They toot the horn, maybe they wind down the window and they yell and they pump their fist. And you can feel that in your body, in your nervous system. I used to be a bit of a road rager, right? Heart rate elevated, gripping the steering wheel. That's a very fight part, right? As opposed to someone who kind of like sits there and listens to like an episode of The Experience with Bradley and like chill and calm and regulated, right?
They're good people. They're good people. Keep listening, folks.
So then they go to work, and what happens? Their boss puts a deadline on their table, higher demand of stress. Then maybe they forget to go to a meeting, higher demand of stress. Then maybe their missus calls them and they've forgotten their anniversary, higher demand of stress. Then they realize they've got to drive home and stop past the florist to get the flowers. And now they're late for this other thing and they're stuck in peak traffic again on the way home. So then they come home and their activation in their nervous system has gone up, 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 up. And remember, when there's too much activation in the nervous system, there has to be a crash in order for the system to come back into homeostasis. And so what happens when they get home? They collapse on the couch and watch Netflix. Maybe, and this is what a lot of my clients do, they spend hours scrolling on TikTok, Reels, very numbing behaviors. Maybe they would turn to food to satiate those feelings. Maybe it's alcohol because there's so much stress, and so they're trying to numb it with alcohol. And so we have all of these experiences showing up for us. And if we don't know how to respond to these external stresses, then our nervous system is just running the show. Now, by knowing this, and this is the really important part, by knowing this and tuning into our nervous system, we can start to create tools to regulate that activation. And then once that's created, those tools for regulation, then your tolerance which would be how you can tolerate the stress, your tolerance can increase. So for example, you're driving to work and the stress comes up and you can notice it because you're gripping the steering wheel. So something like sitting there and doing some breath work would be one of the best ways to do that. And so then you get to work and your boss puts down the deadline, you go, okay, cool. I got this time, I can get it done.
Yeah.
Because your tolerance to experience that stress is now wider and you have more flexibility rather than a really rigid response where you just go straight into fight or flight and it's like, I got this big deadline.
That's really, it makes so much sense because I understand that fully. Something I try to do, because I find for me personally, something that will heighten stress and get me very frantic throughout the course of the day is I'm a really routine driven person around my mornings. Like if my morning routine doesn't go as planned, I find I'm just very frantic and stressed throughout the day. And it's this, I guess, weird relationship with time where I feel like I'm running behind. So if I don't get up at 4:45 a.m. and don't get out and do my walk or my run, jump in the ocean, get my coffee, go home, make my peanut butter and poached eggs on toast and read a bit of my book, I just feel like I'm like far out, the day's thrown out. That's something I'm trying to work. Like this morning, for example, had a very tiring weekend, just felt a little bit exhausted. And I was like, I'm probably going to take some time in the morning to rest and recover. So I had to really be present in my mind this morning that like I was getting in the studio here, not as early as I would normally be. I went for a haircut. So it was even more delayed. And I was like, just chill, like it'll happen. It's going to happen as it's going to happen today. I had to really think about it. And that's a relationship I'm trying to get better with, because going through the back end of last year, working towards, like you said before, that big event or that big goal, which was the marathon, everything was routine, scheduled. And I love that. And I love that I was working towards something. And the consequence of not being on routine was, well, that you probably can't run 42 Ks yet. So if you don't hit that routine, there's a good chance you're not going to be as well prepared. So there were consequences for not being on routine or doing what I was supposed to do. Now it's kind of like, well, yeah, I'm getting back into training. I'm getting back into the flow of things, but maybe slipping away from a routine isn't going to be too detrimental in a month's time because you're still 7 months out from needing to run one. So something I'm trying to work with and create those really healthy habits and relationships again around my routine, my training, my mindset. And it's something that I've got to say I'm pretty blessed, and I feel grateful that it never takes me too long to get back on track with those sort of things.
And really, in a lot of ways, Bradley, what a clever system you have, because if I just break down what you said that when there's this experience of time that feels a little bit different for you, aka your schedule goes off track and there's a different routine to your day, you notice that there's a shift in perhaps your focus, your state of stress, how you experience that day. And so, I mean, what a really clever system you have, because your system knows when there's an event, it really likes planning, analyzing. It's a very fight part, go, 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 but integrated, right? Very helpful. Yeah. It gets the job done, right?
Yeah.
And then so after that experience, this part here, this fight part that loves to plan, loves to take action, very assertive and diligent and likes to act, is now stepping in to say, how can we create this same amount of patterns and routine and action and planning into our everyday life to create some normality and familiarity in the system? So in a lot of ways, your system's really clever because it knows how to do that. And the reason why it's doing that is because the brain likes pattern. It likes the familiarity of knowing what to expect. And if it knows what to expect, then it can keep you safe, right? That's why a lot of people find it really hard to achieve like a new goal or a New Year's resolution, because they have to change something, right? And the brain doesn't like change. It doesn't like a new pattern. That's why they might, spend a couple of weeks and then they go back to their old ways of being, their old patterns. So looking at our nervous system, we can see your nervous system, Bradley, really likes acting. It likes being assertive, planning, diligent, analyzing, assessing. And so you can use that information to say, how might I go about achieving this goal? And the how is really important, because in today's society that's very masculine, we're told to just do it. Just do it. You want to do your goal, just eat in a calorie deficit. And it's like, but how do I do that if maybe I'm in a freeze part and I can't, I feel stuck. I don't feel steady. I feel frozen. I'm scared to get in the gym. I don't know what that's like. So we can look at this question of how might my nervous system be experiencing that? And once we have that information, then we can create these tools to regulate and create these pathways for coherence in our body and our nervous system.
I like that. I like that. And it makes so much sense to me, because you saying all those things now are things that I know in the last week I've been sitting down and looking at and assessing and going, okay, what's this path going to look like now? And exactly what you said, how do I get these things done to ensure that in 6 months' time, I'm reflecting back on the 6 months that has been and go, well, that's how I done it. You know, like the path was clear. Can I ask for maybe the person who's sitting there listening to this or watching us speak right now and can't relate to a nervous system like mine? They're going, well, I'm quite a frantic and crazy individual who can wake up at a different time every day, loves a new challenge or something very sporadic to happen within the 24 hours of each day. What sort of personality trait do you characterize that as? And what are some, action plans that they can put into place to make sure that whilst they're very sporadic and they love that, they're also getting the most out of their weeks?
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps I can give your listeners a resource that actually would apply for everyone.
Yep.
Because there would be no, personality or characteristic to describe that person, but there would be a survival pathway, whether that was a flight part of it all feels too much, or a freeze where they feel quite numb and they're not able to do any of that. And so if we're operating in survival, and ideally we don't want to be operating in survival because it can be very irrational, and it can be done with the fear part of the brain if it's not integrated. What we want to be doing is operating in the front of the brain. And the front of the brain is the PFC, prefrontal cortex, and that's our thinking brain. It's got great ideas, it's creative, it's calm, it's collected. That's really where we want to be operating most of the time. So one of the best ways we can go about operating in the front of our brain and regulating our stress is using things like meditation, breath work, ice baths, which I know I saw you do the other day. Ice baths are a fantastic way to regulate your nervous system and almost reset it in a lot of ways. You can look at doing things like EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, tapping. Social engagement is really great, really regulating for a system. So spending time with people you love, with good high vibe people. And one thing that's really great as well that I love teaching my clients is connecting to their inner child and the things that they like to do when they were younger. So when I was younger, obviously I loved dancing. So whenever I feel a little bit stressed, I always love to dance, move my body. Maybe I go do a dance class, some sort of movement. That part of me really loves, and it's really connecting to a bit of a safe space. So for someone else, it might be drawing, painting, rollerblading, singing. It might be like pottery. It might be running or bike riding or roller skating or ice skating, swimming, surfing. There's so many lists of things you can do. And for a system that doesn't feel safe and might be in survival, doing something that your inner child loves to do is a really good way to regulate stress.
You know, it's funny you say that. And I want to touch on that for a minute, because I had this conversation the other day with my mom. Anyone knows me, knows I love my mom. She's an amazing human, and she's been, you know, an incredible mother, a mother that any kid would be so lucky to have. And for me, she's done so much for, like, her and my dad have done so much for my sister and I. and so much for the people around us, that they're just absolute inspirations. They are literally the parenting handbook for me moving forward when my time comes. But I was speaking to mum the other day, and it's a weird time for mum, and it's a weird time for dad too, I guess, because, you know, I'm 25 now, I'm off doing my thing, and, you know, I'm dependent. So mum's always, oh, can I cook you some lunch for you to pick up tomorrow? Or can I do this? And I'm like, no, I'm all good, mum. I'm sweet. Like, I can handle it. And my sister moves out this week. Her and a partner move into their place, and, you know, they're excited. They're taking that next step in their life. And all of a sudden, I guess mum's like, oh, wow, like, I'm still a mum, but I'm not a mum who has dependent children anymore. So for her, I was talking to her about the importance of like finding that next thing that really consumes all of your time. And I guess if you're listening to this and you're a parent, you should have those things in your life regardless anyways, that are things you love and things that stimulate your mental space and your nervous system, like we spoke about, that make you happy and make you feel like you're working towards something. But for those people that go through that transition in their life and they're now in a new stage, a new chapter, what do you think are some great techniques to find that next thing, that thing that's going to occupy a little bit of your time, that's going to challenge you, that's going to, I guess, take some of that free space? And it's such a hard question. And I guess my advice to mum was like, I was like, Mum, you need to do this now. You need to go be selfish for yourself and go find these things that you love and you want to put plenty of time and energy into. And I was like, and enjoy that journey of finding whatever it is. Do you have any advice for someone, say like my mom or someone else who's listening in that other transitional period of their life?
Yeah, so I mean, just in the interest of speaking to mums, and as well speaking to your mum directly, there's a concept, the one that I mentioned before, around Ikigai, and these Japanese people, and there's this town, I think it's in Okinawa or something like that, and they have the highest rate of longevity. These people live to 100 and 120, and it's because they follow this philosophy of Ikigai. And again, it's a reason for being in your life, and you look at what you love, what the world needs, what you're good at, and what you can be rewarded for. And by doing that, you find your passion, your mission, your vocation, and your profession. And whether you're directly rewarded for it with money, or it's just a different kind of reward, it can be something that whether you're retiring or whether you've been a mum and now your children are off into exploring the world and being independent, finding your Ikigai is a really great way to find a sense of purpose, a sense of enjoyment and fulfillment in your life. So I would recommend listening to the book or the audio book, and finding out what your Ikigai is. Because if you look at myself, my Ikigai actually isn't being a coach. My Ikigai is creativity and self-expression.
And I was just going to ask you what it was for you.
Yeah, so I use that obviously in the form of coaching. But for me, this is why I'm so passionate about podcasts, because I can use creativity to share my story or my models and neuroscience, but I also really get to tune into my self-expression.
I love that.
Yeah, and for me, those two are really core to my purpose for how I show up. You know, if we look at someone like Steve Jobs, we think that his Ikigai was technology, but it actually wasn't. He was a lover of craftsmanship, and he collected these really finely made Japanese teacups, and he would obsess over the design details of his different various products. And so he became immersed in very curated, finely made things. And then, of course, Apple and Pixar were just his chosen ways, his mediums to express that.
I love that. And it's funny you say that. I had this exact conversation with someone yesterday, this exact conversation where I spoke about, have you read Matthew McConaughey's book?
I haven't, no.
Great book. So I sat down and I read Green Lights, and for me, I'm someone who's always been very goal driven. So like my whole life as a kid, very goal driven. In my career, my previous career as a real estate agent, goal driven. Right now in what I do, I feel like I've got very clear, I guess, clear ideas of what I want to achieve and how I want to do it, what I want my life to look like in the future. But I almost had to check myself and sit back and realize what my goals actually were and the difference between a goal and a vehicle to achieving that. And for me, for a long time, I probably identified the podcast, or the experience, as we call it, and the few of you that listen do, as the goal. The goal was to be a hugely successful podcast, to have all these amazing listeners, excuse me, all these amazing listeners and viewers who tuned in every week to the multiple episodes and love the messaging within each of those. But sitting down, I realized that my goal my whole life in some way, shape or form, and ever more clearly and defined right now, is just to be a world-class storyteller. So to share my story and the story of others for really positive benefit, whether that be in form of some education, entertainment, inspiration, to make positive changes in people's lives. For me, realizing that the podcast, whilst it's one of the vehicles to help that, isn't the goal. So the vehicles could be the podcast. It could be a stage with 1,000 people in the audience, or hopefully one day 100,000. It could be a screen, a TV, YouTube, who knows? And I'm okay with whatever it is. It could be, a paperback book. But for me personally, redefining that the goal was just to be a storyteller has opened up a whole new world of avenue and option for me, because stepping back, I'm like, okay, I've been putting so much time and effort into the podcast, and that will continue to happen. But what other vehicles can I be putting my energy and effort into to make sure that I have the best chance of achieving that goal? And that's been a really exciting journey, sitting back and starting to plot and plan this next 12 months, 6 months ahead now, as to how I'm going to go about that. So I love what you say there, because I think that is so important, really sitting down and almost being a little bit critical and very self-aware of yourself and what your goals are, and making sure they're actually the goals and just not the vehicles, because that can be very confusing, I feel, for a lot of people.
Yeah, really powerful stuff. And, this is why I love this whole journey with self-development, because it can just create so many pathways for, such beautiful and really phenomenal concepts that, in some ways really do change your life. It's quite amazing. And it's within all of us, as cheesy as that sounds. This is all stuff that's who we are, and all we have to do is really tune into that and connect with it to find, these answers that we're looking for.
I could not agree more. I'm really interested to hear for you personally. I know that whilst you do your coaching stuff, whilst you're very, I guess, adamant and persistent with your own personal self-development, one of the things you do, and I guess it's part of your job description, is to public speak and to stand on a stage. And as I just said, that's something that I definitely want to do a whole lot more of this year. I set out a goal at the start of 2021, which was to speak on 5 different stages and share my story, which I'm excited to start doing as of next month. Really keen to hear what public speaking does for you personally, and how you feel about that journey of stepping in front of, a large group of people, because it's something that not everyone is very confident with.
Public speaking was probably one of the scariest things I ever thought in my life. And if you'd asked me 4 years ago whether I would do something like that, I would have laughed at you, because I was the kid in high school that would have to, at the end of class, do the English oral while no one else was in the room, because I was so scared of judgment. And I went and did a self-development course, and I really had to confront that bias with judgment and vulnerability. And we were asked to look at our greatest fears. And of course, my greatest fear was public speaking. And then we had to confront that personal bias for what was coming up for us. And it wasn't the actual act of speaking in front of people, it was the vulnerability, which makes sense, because when I was vulnerable when I was 14, I was really traumatized. Definitely. So for me, vulnerability was really scary. And confronting that allowed me to recognize that what I'm sharing actually, in some ways, even if it's my story, is not about me, right? I'm there to share for other people and change their lives. And even if that was just one person, even if that was just one person, you know, and then they went on to change their lives, and then they changed one other person's life, that can create a domino effect for other people as well. So I really looked at this act of public speaking and really looked at what is the fear in it. And it was the vulnerability. And of course, I've done a lot of healing in that. And so when I did my first event, which was last year in March with Lululemon and the Rising Woman, and it was scary. I remember my nervous system was, you know, a little bit of sweat and the heart rate was pumping, right? Of course, it was super real. I wasn't just then immune to, to the fear, but I was able to anchor myself and really ground myself into the overarching theme, which was I'm here to serve other people. And of course, there's going to be some nerves coming up because you're sharing a lot of your story, and there is vulnerability in that. And I guess that just makes you human and really can be a part of your message, which is we're all here having a human experience, and it doesn't need to hold you back from your dreams and your hopes and your aspirations. So really, that was such an important thing for me, was remembering the purpose for why I was there, and reminding myself that even if that was just one person that was listening, that got an aha moment, then I'd done my job.
One of my favorite quotes is Mother Teresa. And of course, I'll paraphrase this. I won't hit it word for word, but she says that not everyone can change the world, but we can all change the world of one person. And I think that's so powerful and so important, that, like you said, that domino effect is highly underrated. And it's something that I think in my original message to you, I sent, like, if we can change the world of one person, well, we've done our job. And I've got no doubt that our conversation here today will do that. And as you said, like that vulnerability, I'm someone who growing up was never, you know, plenty of my schoolmates and longtime friends and family friends will be listening to this. And I was the guy that was on the other extreme, loved to be in front of the crowd, loved to be on stage, because it's just who I was. Like, I was always the guy that was putting on a show or performance at home, or, you know, I'd do the public speaking at school and wanted to be the guy that played the main character in the end of year assembly. I was speaking with an old school friend, Maka Garado, about that the other day, and she recalled, I went to a Christian school, a private school, and she spoke about the time that I played Jesus on the stage for 3 hours because I wanted the main role. And it's funny looking back at that and sitting where I am now and going, well, you know, I guess it's not so confusing or surprising as to why I've ended up doing what I'm doing. But for me, the probably the most powerful moment in front of a group of people, and it wasn't a large group, it was only about 100 people, was at the end of my event last year, and standing there, finished the event, absolutely exhausted, getting up off the ground, and everyone was clapping and, you know, give me a bit of praise and a bit of love, and really nice special moment, and having my family and everyone around. I just kind of had everyone looking at me, and I thought, well, I guess I'm going to give a speech. And I'd planned to say a few words. I didn't expect it would be so quickly after the race, but it just purely come from the heart. And for me, it's the most special moment. It's actually the most special video I've got in my whole life. It was the best day of my life, and particularly the best moment of my life, where I'm able to watch that back and see how emotional it was. My family was crying. A lot of my mates were upset, and, you know, tears of joy, I guess. And for me, looking back on that and being so vulnerable in that moment, it's so nice to look back on, because you understand the power of that, and the power that not only has for you, but for the people around you. And so for everyone listening, you know, you don't have to stand on a stage and share your story. You don't have to sit behind a mic and share the story of others or be vulnerable to the world. But if you can find at least one person in your space that you're comfortable to be vulnerable with, oh man, that's powerful stuff. And it's stuff that will personally change your life. Not even hearing other stories, but being able to speak on yours. Because when you speak and you share it with someone else in the most vulnerable and, I guess, almost carefree, where you're being who you are, because that's you in that way. That's stuff that once you do it one time, it becomes very addictive and you'll never stop. So shout out to all my mates for listening to my deep and meaningful stories all the time.
And you know, something that's really important in what you just shared here is that, and this is something that I learned from Brene Brown, who is a shame researcher, and she talks about vulnerability quite a lot. And the reason why people have such a hard time being vulnerability is because of the shame and the fear and the guilt that comes with that as well. You know, if I share this and they don't understand, or I'm told that I'm being too soft, or I'm overreacting, you know, anything that comes with that, those fear-based stories. And so what happens when you create that space for vulnerability, what it does is it gets rid of that shame around it. And so you actually allow other people to be vulnerable with you. So yeah, really speaking to people who are listening, and if they're wanting to be vulnerable, or they're wanting someone else, their partner, their friends, their family, to be vulnerable with them, that you can open that pathway by being vulnerable with them first, and creating and normalizing that, right? Creating a space that's open and loving and accepting, so that other people feel safe enough to be vulnerable with you.
I think that's so important. That could be one of the biggest takeaways of this whole episode, is create that space for the people around you, because that plays a big part in them opening up. I feel like I could sit here and talk to you for days, but I'm sure you've got places to be later on today. I'm sure you've got other work that you'll want to get done. I'm going to end the conversation here, but I'm going to end it with something, I guess, something new. We'll call it a new little subtopic of the experience. It's something I've been doing. You might see it on my Instagram story every day. Quite often I pester the crew that work downstairs beneath the Experience HQ at Lee and Me, the cafe. And I quite often pester them for some wise words, and I like to put them on the spot. And I guess I'm putting you on the spot now. Whilst there's been many wise words throughout today's episode, maybe just a few that you feel like you remind yourself of every day, or you remind yourself of when you're having one of those moments where you need a little bit of that eternal wisdom.
He loves the hard questions, ladies and gents. There was something that really stayed with me through my whole journey with healing 4 years ago. And I think I shared this with you through a voice memo when we connected. And it was, only at the precipice do we evolve. And for me, that's been a huge overarching driving factor for anything I experience, whether I'm stuck with work, or ending a relationship, or going through trauma, or lost, or unsure. Those words of wisdom really allow me to go, when I'm at the edge, and that edge state, and things feel like the world is collapsing around me, there's always a space to evolve. At that precipice, what is this experience teaching you? And when you're in that valley, right, maybe you don't know what that lesson is, and maybe you don't know the inside of whether it's God or the higher power or the universe, whatever that's teaching you. But when you can go through that and stay with that experience and look at this as a way to teach you to grow and learn, you can open up pathways to overcome those traumas or those fears or the adversity that you're experiencing. You know, and the aim is never to heal yourself or become miraculously better. It's actually a never-ending journey where you keep growing and you keep evolving and you keep developing. That's why they call it self-discovery, not self-discovered.
Yeah.
And a healing journey, not healed, because it's an ongoing journey where you keep learning, and it can be painful and hard, but my gosh, it's ultimately so beautiful.
Nikki, Cassa, you're an incredible storyteller. You're an incredible person. I feel so privileged to be sitting here having this conversation with you, but also to be able to record that and share it with the world. I want to make sure that today isn't the last little bit of Nikki that everyone here from the Experience audience hears. I'm going to make sure that your social links are all in today's show description, as well as those links for some of those organizations or safe places for people to be reaching out who are suffering from traumatic experiences or suffering from trauma in the present. Thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to me. as I'm sure I said in our messages when we connected to do this, to anyone who gives the time to come on the show and share their story, I'm eternally grateful. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and likewise, very grateful to have this space to feel safe and open up and share my experience. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. Everyone, subscribe, give those 5-star ratings and those raving reviews. We love it. Tell your best mates, your mom, your dad, your dog, play it at home, put it on as you drive to work and get stress-free. Stop gripping that steering wheel so hard. And yeah, just enjoy these conversations we have, because I definitely enjoy sitting here hosting them. Big love to everyone. Cheers.